thoughts or comments that you have. So yeah, I'm a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University, which is in Nova Scotia in Canada. And what a PhD candidate means is it's just someone who's doing their PhD and is kind of at the final stages of doing the PhD. So I'm in my 4th year now, and I do a lot of marine research, and my main focus is marine research. And just to give an idea of where I am relative to you, so this is where you guys are located here right now. So even though I'm an international speaker, I am not too far away from you. So it's just a small plane ride away to Nova Scotia. So this is where I am. So I am literally right on the ocean here. We can see the ocean from my window. And so Nova Scotia is a small province in Canada, and it's right on the water. There's a lot of small fishing villages and fishing towns. There's a lot of lighthouses everywhere, and we get a lot of snow in the winter, so we have a lot of snow now. And this is Halifax. This is the main city where most of the things happen in Nova Scotia. So unlike New York, we don't have any high rises or anything like that. So these are kind of our biggest buildings around the city. There's about 300,000 people living in Halifax. And maybe for like 1 month of the year that we get summer, things kind of bloom and we have green trees around. And this is a picture of the university I'm attending. This is the administration building. It's kind of one of those advertising shots that they took. Yeah, so this is where I live now. And I study, specifically for my PhD, I study phytoplankton. Have any of you heard of phytoplankton or know what they are? Okay, so I see some no's and I see maybe a yes, so that's great. So phytoplankton are these very tiny organisms that live in all of the world's oceans. So as you can see from this picture, there's many different shapes and sizes and colors and structures that phytoplankton come in. So there's many different types of phytoplankton that are found all over the world. And they're microscopic, so you really can't see them with your naked eye unless you put them under the microscope. And why we study them is because they're an extremely important group of organisms. They produce about half of the oxygen on Earth. So it's just half of the oxygen you breathe in every time you take a breath comes from the ocean because of these organisms. So we want to know more about them purely because they produce half of the oxygen that we inhale. And they also form the base of all food webs in the ocean. So anytime you see fish or whales or seals or seabirds or anything related to the ocean, it all starts with phytoplankton kind of absorbing that sun energy and converting it into organic material to support that food chain. So the idea here is that the oceans are changing because of climate change. You know, the temperatures are rising, we have ocean acidity happening and whatnot. And we really want to understand how that's impacting phytoplankton, because we want to know how our Earth is going to look like in the future under climate change. So this is just an illustration of phytoplankton around the world. And what you can see here are the different colors represent different phytoplankton groups. So this is a map of the world. This is North America here. This is Australia. And the red represents a phytoplankton group called diatoms. The yellow, something called flagellates, and so on. And as you can see, in all of the world's oceans, as time progresses, so this is kind of a year starting from January all the way to December. As time progresses, we start to find that phytoplankton kind of bloom at different times of the year. So let's look at the Antarctic, for example. This is now we're in the Antarctic summer. There's a lot of phytoplankton, the red, and then at the Antarctic winter, they kind of all die, and then they bloom again in the summer. Same thing that's happening in the Arctic. In other places, they're always there. So no matter what time of year it is, we always see these phytoplankton. And as you can see, as the ocean currents move and change, the phytoplankton concentrations change with those currents. So even when you go all the way down to the Antarctic, literally by the South Pole, or all the way up to the North Pole, we see that we have phytoplankton blooming and contributing to that production of oxygen and that food web around Earth. So the phytoplankton I study specifically live in the Antarctic, so just kind of down here. And what we do is basically go to the Antarctic and study the ecology of the region. So this is a cruise that we went to that went to the Antarctic and looked at ice in the region. And what's really striking here is you start to see these brown spots on the ice everywhere. And the first thought was, many years ago when people first saw this, they were like, how is the ice polluted in the Antarctic? Like, who's dumping waste in the Antarctic? And it turned out that this is actually not pollution or not waste at all. It is phytoplankton that are growing on the ice itself. So they tend to live in extreme environments, or they can live in extreme environments. So right here, they're living in sub-zero temperatures, and they're in extremely high concentrations that you can actually see how dense they are. So what we do is we take samples of these phytoplankton from the ice or the water, and we take them to the lab using machines or instruments like this. So this is called a CTD rosette. And these tubes here are, they're like massive water bottles. And what you do is you sink them, you dunk them into the water and collect water from the ocean at different depths. And this is what it looks like when you put it in the water. So you notice here the tubes are open, so there's an opening on the top. And once you get it to the depth that you want, this all kind of automatically controlled, and there's a lot of buttons and whatnot you press from the ship. So we're on a ship right now, and this closes because it's at a certain depth, and then you capture that water at a certain depth. And we can do this all the way from the surface, all the way down to thousands of meters below the surface. And this here is the size of a car. So you may not be able to see it from, it might not be obvious from this video, but this is a very big machine that we use. And then we bring these water samples back to the lab and we grow them under different environmental conditions. So let's say we want to study how temperature change or warming oceans affect phytoplankton growth. Because we can't warm the entire ocean at once, what we do is we bring the samples to the lab and grow them under different conditions that we expect the oceans to be at, let's say in the next 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. And this is what it looks like when you grow them in the lab. We use, special equipment, special bottles and whatnot. And we grow them under these conditions and study how their behavior changes under the different environmental conditions. So one thing we can do is actually observe the cell. So you can look at a cell, and this is a 3D reconstruction I did of one phytoplankton cell. And what you can see here is two red spots. And those two red spots are where the chloroplasts are. Or in other words, this is where photosynthesis happens. And this is really cool because we can grow this cell under different conditions and see how the photosynthetic structures in the cell change under those different conditions. And this can tell us how oxygen production will change and how much nutrients the cell have, so how that impacts the food chain in the future. So from a single cell, you can kind of do a lot of experiments to make inferences about what's happening on a much grander scale. And kind of on the last slide here, throughout my work, I've had a really cool a lot of cool opportunities to travel and do experiments in many different capacities. So one of them was going on this research cruise that I showed you videos and pictures from on this vessel here called the Hudson. And so we were out there for 3 weeks collecting samples and doing experiments on board of this ship. And one other experience that I've had that was really cool was flying to this island here that's called Sable Island. And it's just it's a very skinny island. I mean, you can just, it's probably a few tens of meters across. And it's just a long, skinny island in the shape of a C. And what you do is you fly to the island and land on the beach, literally this stretch of beach here. And this is what you land on. And we spend a few days there collecting water samples and air samples and studying the phytoplankton populations around this specific island. So it's really cool when you kind of start studying biology or any kind of science. You have a lot of opportunities to go to these remote places and do experiments. And you also have opportunities to get into a lab and use some really cool equipment and kind of really focus on studying something very small and very specific. And I've had the opportunity to do, a range of those big experiments and very, very small, tiny things in the lab. So that's really cool. And I think that's the end of my presentation here, because I'm more interested in hearing what kind of questions you have, or thoughts or comments. So if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask now, please feel free. Or if not, I can pull up the list of questions that you already sent before, and we can go through them one by one.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I know in molecular biology, when we're going like bacteria, we put it in like a nutrient broth. I was just like wondering, like, what do you put the bacteria in to help it like grow when you guys do experiments?
Yeah, so it's exactly that. It's a special type of nutrient broth. So there's many different types of nutrient broths, and the key thing is, let's say we get this or a phytoplankton from the ocean. You want to get something that is similar to an ocean environment. So what you can do is literally get ocean water and big barrels of it and leave it in your lab. And then when you get a new organism, you take some of that water and grow it in there, and you can supplement it with extra nutrients. Or what I do is I make something called artificial seawater. So I get the ultra pure water from a special machine, and then add the different salts and compounds that you would find in the sea to it, to kind of make that water artificially. And this way I know exactly what's in it, and I can control every element in that water to my specifications.
Okay. Also, do you ever like deal with like mutations?
Yeah. So I do a lot of molecular biology, and mutations are interesting because so these phytoplankton can mutate at a very fast rate, so they can evolve as you put them as you start your experiments. And there's some problems where if you start an experiment now, for example, and you go to repeat it, let's say 5 years from now, using the same cultures that you started with, they might be a little bit different from when you started, and you might not see the same results, and that's because they're mutated. But you can also make your own mutations by altering the DNA or the genetic makeup of the cells, and mutate them to your own specifications. So that's something that I do regularly as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I should have warned you, Loay, that we have a molecular biology course at our high school.
Nice, that's cool.
Well. And that's why Tahir is asking these very complex scientific questions that are probably well beyond what a high school student might typically ask. So very good, Tahira. I'll tell Mr. Goldberg that you were asking some good molecular bio questions, so he knows. Who else has some questions? Ashley, I see you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Why do you collect water samples from different depths? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The phytoplankton tend to live within kind of the first 100 meters of seawater because they're photosynthetic. They need the sun's energy to survive. So anywhere below 100 meters, the sun doesn't really penetrate water that far in, and then they can't grow. But there's a lot of other things living underneath those, underneath that 100 meters, that also contribute to the entire life cycle within the ocean. So let's say then what you want to do is take samples from the first 100 meters to capture the phytoplankton, and then and then 200 meters in to capture a different type of organism, and so on, all the way down to the thousands of meters. And this way you get a profile of the different types of organisms. And by organisms, I mean microscopic organisms here, that are inhabiting those different regions of the oceans. Otherwise, you're just capturing, one type of organism, and you're making all your conclusions based on one type of organism. And that's not the way it is, because all of these organisms within the ocean kind of interact with each other all the time. So we need to know what's happening in the entire space.
Thank you.
Who has some other questions? Hilbriel, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
So, like, in your map that show like the 4 different kinds of phytoplankton, how are they distinguished? Like, how do you know which type is which?
Which is which? Yeah. So this is a map you're talking about. If you look at this picture here, I can see at least two types here, minimum, I would say. So there's this is one type of phytoplankton. You see this kind of sphere with many little dots in it. So this is a type of phytoplankton that forms aggregates. So each one of these dots is a cell. And what they do is they kind of come together to form this bigger structure that helps them live, that helps them survive. I think one of the reasons they do this is to make themselves look bigger so things don't come and eat them. The other type is called the diatom, and this is a diatom here. And diatoms have glass frustules, they call them. It's kind of like a glass structure around the cell that helps protect it from the environment and from predators. So in this particular model here, people have went to all these regions and collected samples. And so not like all of this place, maybe they collected a sample here, a sample here, a sample here, and they made kind of a general conclusion that in this area, there's mostly diatoms, and in this area, there's mostly flagellates and whatnot. But there's also a lot of satellite data that we use because, so like we said, these are photosynthetic organisms that live on the surface of the ocean or the first 100 meters. So what they do is they emit a special spectrum back into the atmosphere. So in this microscopy picture I showed you, see those red dots where chlorophyll is? So this is called fluorescence. And we can't see it with our eyes, but if we have special instruments, we can actually measure it. And this is what's happening with this type of microscope. And we can put those instruments on satellites, and that's what people did. And they can measure this fluorescence from the cells. And different types of cells have different fluorescence values, and we're able to distinguish them that way. So my diatom is fluorescing red in this particular image. And when you look at this model, the diatoms here are in the red. So it's there's a lot of math involved in here, and I'm a biologist, but there's there's a lot of mathematicians and physicists that are working on kind of these algorithms, but I trust what they're doing.
Thank you.
There is a question in the chat, Loay, and Sakina asked, what other places can you find them?
Yeah, so everywhere in the ocean, anywhere you go that there's seawater, that you're going to find phytoplankton. Other places are freshwater bodies, so like lakes and riverbanks and rivers. And another really interesting place where you can find phytoplankton is on mosses on trees sometimes. So if you go take a walk in the woods, or if you find a tree that has moss on it, and the moss is a greenish color, especially after it rains, then there's a special type of phytoplankton that lives on the moss and kind of blooms or grows fast when the moss gets wet after a rain. And so it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. So that's kind of one of the only phytoplankton species that we know of that lives on land, that doesn't require like an actual water body.
Gabrielle, go ahead.
Is it possible for there to be an overpopulation of like phytoplankton? And if there is, like what effect does it have on the environment?
Yeah, so overpopulation, you mean like too much phytoplankton, right? Yeah, so that's actually a really big problem that we're facing today, because so phytoplankton, they require sun and they require nutrients to live, so like any other organism. And what's happening now with all the agriculture that we're having on land, we have this thing called runoff. So because we're fertilizing our land all the time, we have a lot of nutrients that are being washed from the land into the sea. And as nutrients get washed off into the sea, the sea is becoming an extremely fertile environment for phytoplankton to grow. So we're experiencing an environment where we have way too much phytoplankton in the water. And what this causes a lot of problems, because first of all, the phytoplankton grows so dense that they restrict sunlight from going to the bottom of the water, and that affects organisms that live on the bottom of the water. And when you also have really dense phytoplankton blooms, it kind of creates an environment that is a little anoxic. so there's not a lot of oxygen in the water because there's a lot of different cycles happening. And what this does is it kills fish in a lot of regions. So that's something that's been well observed, especially close to agricultural areas where kind of fish just turn up dead, and that's because of this super dense phytoplankton growth. And some phytoplankton also have toxins in them. So if you have a strong growth of toxic phytoplankton, that can be really dangerous too.
And is like the red tide, when like the algae is like toxic, is that made up of phytoplankton?
Yep. Yeah, so red tides are made of phytoplankton. A species of phytoplankton causes red tides, not diatoms, but even though they're red, they fluoresce red. But yeah, so it's a species of phytoplankton, and because of climate change, the environments that promote the growth for red tides are also changing. So we don't really know how climate change is going to influence red tides in the future, and that's why it's important to study phytoplankton.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
These are great questions, folks. What other questions do you have? Does anyone have any other ones? Ashley, you got another one. Go for it.
Why do the diatoms around the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle frequently disappear?
Very good question too. So if you think about the really high latitudes like the Arctic and Antarctic, they experience months with no light during their winter, and then months with light during their summer. So when you get into the dark phases there, where there's no sun for 6 months, phytoplankton can't survive because they're photosynthetic, so they're just like plants. So they can't get sun, they can't grow. And another reason is because it gets too cold, so everything freezes over. And even though they're able to live in the ice, but if everything freezes over, they're not able to access that sun anymore either. So yeah, it's just a matter of not having sun.
Who else? Anyone else have a question? Oh, Gabrielle, you have another one.
Have you always studied phytoplankton, or have you done like research on other mammals or other stuff like that?
Yeah, so I have not always studied phytoplankton. I study. So when I started kind of doing science, I started studying plants and fungi. So my first kind of research was looking at how a special strain of fungus grows inside the leaves of plants and how it affects plant growth. So I did a lot of plant biology and I did a lot of fungal research. And then I was done with that, and then I started studying insects. And that was really cool. I was really interested in insects and I wanted to know more about insects. So I studied insects for about 2 years. And after that, I got a scholarship to study phytoplankton on this island here, Sable Island. And after I did my research on phytoplankton here, I got a scholarship to do my PhD, which took me to where I am now, doing kind of phytoplankton work in the Antarctic. So I haven't studied anything in the ocean other than phytoplankton, but I've done a lot of research on other things, insects and plants mostly. Yeah.
Sakina, go for it.
Will global warming affect the growth of I can't pronounce that word, sorry.
Phytoplankton?
Yes.
So that is the $1 million question. That's why we're so there's many people around the world trying to figure that out, and it's not just whether global warming will affect them, but it's how. Because we know it will. It's going to change their environments they live in. If a phytoplankton is adapted to live in the Antarctic where it's always cold, and then the Antarctic is getting warm, then there's going to be problems there. But so a lot of researchers are spending a lot of effort and time and energy studying how climate change will affect them. So will they grow faster? Will they grow slower? Will different species grow in different regions that they're not expected to grow in? And what does that mean for Earth, you know? So let's say we have a decrease in phytoplankton growth overall. Does that mean we have less oxygen on Earth? Or does that mean the food webs in the ocean will be affected? These are all questions that we don't know the answers to right now, but we do know one thing: global warming is happening, and we need to understand how that's affecting phytoplankton. So, yeah.
Sydney, go ahead.
How are your like trips and like overall research? How is that funded? Is it funded by like the university or by yourself?
Yeah. So you when you go to graduate school, or if you're doing research at a university or an institution, you don't pay for your own trips, mainly because they're very expensive. So, for example, a trip on this ship here costs about $50,000 a day, and we go for 3 weeks. So it's unless you're a multi-billionaire, or you can't afford these trips. The other thing is these trips are organized, on a very large scale. So you have governments involved, and you have many universities involved, and many researchers from many different countries involved. So the trips are funded by either governments or grants that you get from different institutions. And basically, what they say is, the government will say, for example, this trip here, the Canadian government said, we're going to buy time on this ship for 3 weeks. And they kind of put this call out to researchers in Canada and all over the world. And researchers applied to join this expedition. And they kind of say, I want to do this, I want to discover this, or ask this particular question on this trip. And then they get accepted to the trip, and then you can get your research done. So you don't pay anything to do these trips.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have some budding world travelers, and so they want to know how to do this on somebody else's dime.
Yeah, so I'll give you another kind of tip here. If you do research, you got a chance to go to a lot of conferences. So one of the main things in science is you want to share what you learned with others, right? So one of the ways to do that is to go to conferences and talk to colleagues and present your research and listen to what people have done. And in the last 5 or 6 years that I've been a researcher, I've probably gone to maybe 10 conferences all over the world, and they're all paid for, So I've been to the US several times, to Europe, and to, many different places, and they put you in a hotel and you get to tour around the city, and yeah, all on somebody else's dime.
Of course, this was all pre-COVID, so
yeah.
Conferences are now all virtual.
Yeah, now we have to sit in front of a screen and.
Sakina had another question in the chat, and I'll read off what she wrote. I don't know if you can see it. She asked, who discovered phytoplankton?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to, but I can tell you a little bit about the history of phytoplankton. So a while ago, probably in the 1930s or before the 1930s, people knew that there was something in the ocean that was sustaining the food web. So just like plants on Earth kind of on land sustain the food web on land, there had to be something in the ocean that was providing food for all the fish and everything else. So they knew there was phytoplankton in there, but they didn't have the tools to collect them and study them. So what they did, they had these kind of small nets, like a mesh, and they went in the water and they kind of scooped water with that mesh and tried to see what's captured in that net. But the nets weren't fine enough to capture most of the phytoplankton in the water, so they only captured the big ones, and those were only a small portion. But over time, as tools became more advanced and as we had more and more equipment, we were able to discover more phytoplankton as we advanced. But there's also one of the most abundant group of organisms on Earth, period, was only discovered about 30 years ago, and that was in the ocean. So even though we discovered phytoplankton, we know what phytoplankton are, there's so many more species waiting to be discovered, And like I said, the most abundant organism ever on Earth was discovered 30 years ago, and it was in the ocean. So, yeah.
Does like
Gabrielle.
the sorry.
Go ahead. I was
Do-
going to say you had another question, so go for it.
Do the microplastics in the ocean affect like phytoplankton in any way? Like, do you ever, like, when you do your like research, do you pick up microplastics?
Yeah, so microplastics don't really affect phytoplankton per se, because phytoplankton don't eat anything. So microplastics typically affect organisms that ingest things from the water. So phytoplankton kind of make their own food from the sun's energy and from nutrients in the water. Where microplastics become important is the higher trophic level. So when zooplankton come to eat the phytoplankton, they can ingest microplastics by accident. And then when a small fish comes to eat those zooplankton, they ingest more microplastics, and then so on. So at the smallest level, there's not a lot of microplastics in organisms. But once you get up the food chain, you start to have an accumulation of microplastics. So in big fish and in bigger organisms, there's a lot more microplastics than you would find at the smaller level.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Who else has a question? I think my dog has a question. Sakina, go for it.
Like plants, when they take in carbon dioxide and they give us oxygen, is it same thing with I can't pronounce this. I'm sorry.
With phytoplankton?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's the exact same process. Actually, so plants evolved from phytoplankton in the water. So the photosynthetic apparatus in plants came from phytoplankton, millions of years ago through evolution. So they do exactly the same thing. The carbon dioxide that is in the air kind of gets absorbed into the water, and they use that carbon dioxide, and then they produce oxygen, which is then released from the water into the atmosphere.
So if there's an oil spill in the ocean, would that affect the process?
Absolutely, yeah. So if there's an oil spill, that will probably kill a lot of the phytoplankton in wherever that oil spill is. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, who else has a question? Do you have other questions? I would like to ask you a question while they're thinking. How did you get interested in marine biology and this area of scientific research?
Okay, so when I was doing my undergraduate degree, so I did my undergraduate degree in Nova Scotia at a place called Acadia University. It's a small university, about 3,000 students, and I was doing pre-med there, so I wanted to become a doctor. And so in my final year, kind of applying to med school, I was super excited about it, and I met with one of my professors to talk about my goals. And I told him, like, I'm so excited about finding new things and asking new questions, and I just want to learn more about everything. And he really asked me, he's like, do you really want to be a doctor? Because if you're a doctor, you're going to spend all your time focusing on one organism, humans. And then I thought about it, and I was like, maybe I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be able to do all this. I want to be able to study anything I want on Earth. And that was kind of the catalyst for me starting thinking about biology from a non-medical perspective, and more about, I want to discover and learn as much as possible about anything on Earth. So that's when I started doing plant research and then insect research. And then in my final year of doing insect research is when I got this scholarship to go on this island here. And that's when I really got excited about phytoplankton and marine research. Before that, I didn't really know much about marine research. I didn't even know what phytoplankton were until this project. So at that point, once I kind of learned about how important they are and that they produce half the world's oxygen, then I was hooked. I was like, I need to study these organisms and I need to know more about them. Yeah.
That's great to hear, because I know, I think very often our high school students feel a little bit of pressure to decide, this is what I want to do, and make a decision. And I think it's important. I also had a career that kind of zigzagged, and you don't necessarily have to make a decision right away. I mean, you go in one path and you can change directions.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the best things about being a scientist is you can do whatever you want, basically, within reasons. Like I can't go be an astronaut now, but within reason, you can change as many times as you want. Like, people ask me, hey, what I want to do after I finish my PhD. I'm like, I don't know, maybe I'll open a restaurant, or I don't know. Yeah.
I see we have a couple of hands raised here. Delaney, why don't you go first?
I'm gonna ask the silly question that has nothing to do with like actual science. What's your favorite sea animal?
Okay, that's a good question too. I don't know if I have a favorite sea animal. I think phytoplankton. I'm a little impartial to phytoplankton. There probably will have to be my favorite organisms in the ocean. Sea animal. I mean, other than phytoplankton, maybe pilot whales. Actually, this picture here, maybe I'll show you this. This picture here, when we were collecting water, we had a bunch of these little pilot whales come up to the ship. Can you see them? Yeah, so they were just like with us the whole time, and they were a little problem because we wanted to collect samples of phytoplankton right by next to the ship. But when you have a lot of pilot whales around the ship, do you know what they're doing all this time? They're pooping, and then they're so every time we collect a sample, it just comes up with a bunch of water that's full of poop. So we had to wait until they were gone and then collect more samples. But yeah, they're cool. I like pilot whales. They're playful and they're friendly.
Tahira, you have your hand raised too.
So like I was just wondering if there's any other jobs in like marine biology, because like my coworker, she's like, I love marine biology, but like I can't be like a full-on biologist because, you know, with like the PhD and everything. And I was just like wondering if people aren't interested in it, if there's like other positions that are like beneath you or like around you that people can do without getting a full like doctorate degree.
Yeah, so there's tons of jobs. I think so you definitely don't need a doctorate degree to do marine biology, or you don't even need a degree to do marine biology. I think anyone can go and do marine research and explore and ask questions. I think the main thing is to be curious and to have an open mind and just be curious. But in terms of jobs, so like I said, it takes a really big effort and a lot of large groups to do these research expeditions. And one of the jobs, for example, would be me collecting these samples and studying these samples. But another job, so there's a team of 4 people that would be controlling this instrument here. Then that's their whole job, is to control this instrument. So they wouldn't even be biologists, but they would still be going on these expeditions, and their job would be to control these instruments. Another person's job would be to operate the microscopy facility, for example, where I took those pictures. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something related to a PhD or anything like that. In a lot of cases, you probably need to go to university, maybe get an undergraduate degree or a master's degree. But there's a whole suite of jobs that you can do that are in marine science or marine research.
So you know how you got like you applied or like you got the scholarship. So how are people like those jobs, like controlling that machine? Like how do they pick those people?
Well, so for one of the things is you see job postings, or this particular research facility is hiring someone to do a specific job. And in a lot of places, they train you for these jobs. So you're not like going to university to learn how to operate this instrument. But you apply and then you show interest, and then they train you for these jobs. Another way is to kind of be involved in things as you go through high school and university. So it's a great thing that what you guys are doing now is this club. Well, you get to meet new people and make new connections. And when you go to university, if you decide to go to university, one thing to do is do an honors degree, or ask if a professor wants you to shadow them or shadow some of their students in the lab, or volunteer in somebody's lab. And this way you kind of get an idea of what kind of jobs are there and what kind of opportunities are there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There was another question in the chat. Sakina asked, where are phytoplankton most abundant in the ocean?
So they are actually most abundant around the Antarctic area. Even though this is a pretty small area relative to the entire world, the phytoplankton here contribute to most of the oxygen production in the world. And they're only growing for like half the year there. So even though they're growing for half the year, and it's this very small region relative to the rest of the world, this is where phytoplankton are most abundant. But there's little pockets around the world, like the Arctic. There's tons of phytoplankton, and they're also pretty abundant close to the shores of the continents and close to land. And that's because there's a lot of nutrients in those areas, kind of like nutrients coming off the land, and phytoplankton like to live where nutrients are.
So if they're saying that the polar ice caps are melting due to climate change, is that affecting the phytoplankton growth?
Yeah, for sure. So that's one of the main questions I'm trying to answer in my PhD is how is that like melting and warming affecting phytoplankton growth? And one of the things that happens with melting is the water temperature goes up. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, as the melting happens, it kind of changes the physics of the water and how the water cycles through the ocean. And that influences how phytoplankton experience light, and how they also get nutrients, because there's, the ocean currents also move nutrients throughout the world. So yeah, there's a lot of factors at play. The light is changing and the nutrients are changing because of warming, and all of those are affecting the growth of phytoplankton simultaneously. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? Maybe you can look at some of those questions that we sent you ahead of time, Loay, and see if there's anything there that maybe we didn't hit on.
Okay, so maybe I can go through them quickly one by one, and then when did you realize you wanted to become a marine biologist? I think we covered that. That's when I discovered when I didn't want to become a doctor. So, what do you do in your job? So I like this question because a lot of people think, a scientist or a marine biologist spend most of their time in the ocean doing these experiments. But as a scientist, you spend a lot of time actually in front of a computer looking at data. We have, all these complicated instruments that produce a ton of data. And without you looking at the data and making sense of it, it means nothing. So I spend probably 70% of my time looking at data and writing reports and writing papers. It's important to look at the data and interpret it, but it's also really important to tell people about it. That's how we advance in science, and that's how humanity advances. So you want to write papers and write reports about what you find. So I spend a lot of time doing that, and then a lot of time doing research in the lab or going out to sea and doing research there. What school did I go to for my undergrad? So that was a place called Acadia University. It was a great experience if you're looking for a school outside of the US. Are there other jobs? Okay, we covered that one. What do you like most about your job? I think I like everything about my job. Doing a PhD is great because you get paid to do it, even though you're still in school. So you get paid to do it, but you also get a lot of benefits with doing a PhD. One of them is travel. You got discounts at grocery stores because you're a student. You also get a free bus pass. So there's a lot of cool things you get with it. But I also like the freedom that comes with doing science, where you can, if I'm interested or curious about something, you can actually go and pursue it, and that is really cool. What do I need to become a marine biologist? So that's a good question. One of the main thing you need is curiosity. You need to be curious, and you need to have an open mind. It would help if you go to university and study some sort of science. So you don't necessarily need to study marine biology right off the get-go, but it's good to have an understanding of what science is and how science is conducted. Because marine biology or marine science is a pretty big area, and the foundation is science. If you have a science foundation, it will help you kind of become a marine biologist. Most important characteristic, I think curiosity is one of the most important characteristics. Does your family support your job? They do. I don't think most of the time it's really difficult to tell my family what I do, because I want to tell them all the details on all the molecular stuff, and my family is not scientists, so it's kind of hard to communicate with them what I'm doing. But they're supportive, yeah, for sure. Have you thought about giving up your job? So not yet. Not, it's a pretty doing science and doing a PhD specifically. You have a lot of really high highs and a lot of really low lows. So sometimes you discover something new and it's super exciting, and sometimes you spend 6 months in a lab and then you realize your experiment didn't work and you wasted 6 months. So you need to have kind of a level-headed personality where things are going to fail and learn from your mistakes and move on. So I haven't thought about giving up, but I've thought about a lot of the time that I wasted and I thought I wasted, but now in hindsight, it was like a good learning experience to do that. I think there's a question here in the chat.
Yes, she asked if you can find phytoplankton in glaciers.
Yes. So not deep into the glaciers, but at the terminal where the glacier meets the water, there's a lot of phytoplankton growing there. Actually, 2 students in my lab, they're doing their projects on phytoplankton growing, glacial phytoplankton up in the Arctic. And another really important area of study, because glaciers are melting and we want to know how that's affecting phytoplankton. But yeah, there's tons of phytoplankton close to great glaciers.
Tyler, I saw your hand raised at one point. Did you have a question? Or was that an accidental hand raising? I don't think he's there right this minute. So I'm going to assume it's he accidentally raised his hand. I don't know if there are other questions that you folks are waiting to ask. Oh, there's Tyler. Tyler, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? I saw your hand raised a moment ago.
I think I had a question, but I'm not gonna lie to you. I think I forgot it. If I remember, I'll come back. I apologize.
Okay. That's all right.
Sure. I think Tahira also has her hand up. Oh,
I'm sorry, that's from before.
Okay.
Oh, you can hit your button to there you go.
Yeah.
Tyler, did you remember your question?
Yes, I remember my question now. Thank you. So, I know you said, I know for like a lot of PhD students that they do like they're like teaching assistants and things like that in colleges. Mm-hmm. Do you do that at all as a PhD candidate?
Yeah, I do. So depending on in the U.S. it's a bit different, because a lot of U.S. in the States, a lot of PhD funding comes from you teaching. So you have to teach in order to make some money to pay your tuition and whatnot. In Canada, it's different, where when you start your PhD, they provide you funding for the entire PhD, and you don't have to teach to make money, that is. But part of doing a PhD is not just being able to do research, but it's also being able to communicate your research and teach other people. That's a very important part of being a scientist. So some of the requirements in my program is I have to teach three courses throughout my entire PhD. So that's like 3 courses in 4 to 6 years. I like teaching a lot, so I've done a lot more than 3 courses. But you get to really practice your teaching and hone your teaching skills during your PhD, if that's something you're interested in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There is another question in the chat that says, will glaciers affect phytoplankton in a negative or positive way?
Well, that depends. So glaciers are interesting because they kind of start from land, right? And then they kind of terminate in the water. And what this does is, as the ice moves from the land to the water, it kind of scrapes rocks and dirt from land into the water. And what this does is it brings nutrients from the rocks and the dirt into the water. And these nutrients are used by phytoplankton to grow. But the downside to that is it also makes the water more murky if they're scraping a lot of dirt and mud. And murky water means there's not a lot of sun, and not a lot of sun means not a lot of phytoplankton growth. So it depends on what glaciers and how the dynamics in the region are changing, on how they change. So the students I was talking about in my lab that study glaciers, they're looking at two glaciers that are super close to each other, and they're finding that the way they're affecting phytoplankton is completely different. So it's hard to kind of tell what's happening overall unless we focus on specific glaciers and to get the big picture.
Does anyone else have a question? Oh, I think they've gone silent.
Yeah, if not, we can keep going through some of these questions.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
So I think we covered the last one. And the next set of questions is, I wanted to show you this video before we leave. What is the end goal of your research? Is there a specific problem you hope to mollify or solve with your findings? Yeah, so I think the end goal behind my research is to kind of understand how global warming is affecting phytoplankton growth. That's a really big question because I can't answer it by myself. It's I'm only doing a very small part to answer that question. I like to think about it as a puzzle where I solve one piece and somebody else solves another piece, and then kind of after all these collaborations, we can see the bigger picture. But overall is how climate change affects phytoplankton growth. What was the most difficult part about becoming a marine biologist? So I think for me, the most difficult part was trying to understand the basics behind marine biology, because I didn't do marine biology in my undergrad, or I didn't think about it at all. And then once I kind of started in it, I was already within a group of people that had studied it for years and they knew a lot about it. So I didn't know anything about it. So the most difficult part was kind of catching up. So I had to do a lot of catching up. That was one thing. And just realizing that even though I didn't know a lot of my peers also, even though it looks like they know a lot, they didn't know a lot either. So it's kind of realizing that everyone has so much to learn. And I was kind of a little intimidated by that in the beginning, where I thought I didn't know anything and I thought I was stupid, but kind of realized that everyone has so much to learn. And that was kind of one of the main things, one of the toughest things about becoming a marine biologist, is just realizing that I also have a lot to learn and everyone else has a lot to learn. So were there any electives that I took in high school that helped me? The short answer is no. So funnily enough, I grew up in the Virgin Islands. I did my high school in the Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands. And it was, there was water everywhere and everything. But my high school was super tiny. There was 6 people in my entire graduating class. So we didn't really have electives or anything like that. I was the first graduating class from the school. So I like to say we were the guinea pigs of the high school. They kind of tested different things on us and saw what worked and didn't work. So there weren't electives that helped me kind of become a scientist or a biologist, but we did have a science club that I started. And in the science club, we got to kind of discuss science ideas and chat with teachers and stuff like that. So that helped a little bit. Yeah. What are the coolest things you found while researching plants, insects, and phytoplankton? So one of the coolest things is discovering or learning that phytoplankton produce half of the world's oxygen. And the other cool thing is this video here. So this is when I was doing research on insects. And I was doing research on trying to understand how insects actually smell their environment. And insects use their antenna to smell. So just anytime you see a butterfly or a moth with these big antenna, they're actually, that's their noses. That's what they use to smell the environment. And I was doing this research on flies to see what they smell, kind of to like, it's like a house fly. Why is it attracted to dead stuff or whatever? Anyway, so what we do is we put the flies in this kind of restraining thing, and I exposed it to a specific smell, and the fly went crazy. It kind of extended its proboscis. This is what it uses to feed, and it would just kept doing that over and over and over. So what we discovered here is that the fly really, really likes that specific smell, and this is what attracted this fly. This particular smell attracted this fly to certain foods in your house. So it was a really cool thing to see, and I discovered it by accident. I was actually getting ready to do a bunch of dissections on the fly's brain while it was alive, and I just puffed this compound just to see, and then it did this, and then my entire project changed after this moment.
Tahira, I see you have a question.
This isn't a question, it's more of a comment.
Mm-hmm.
In AP biology, we studied like house flies and stuff like that. And we did like genetics, and we like found like the different, like some had red eyes and some didn't have like wings.
Yeah.
So like cool that you guys do that too.
Yeah, that's cool. So a lot of the stuff you learn in biology in high school is super applicable to what you do in research in the real world. So that's cool that you guys are doing that.
Yeah.
There wasn't another question in the chat. They asked, do you think we can find phytoplankton on Mars?
Oh, good question. Unlikely we'll find phytoplankton that are alive on Mars, but who knows? Maybe they were there a long time ago. Maybe like a very rudimentary form of plankton or phytoplankton that's kind of dead and buried in the sand, in the soil. There, yeah. Have you guys been following up the Mars rover adventures, the recent ones?
I know some of our students have. They said a few years ago they were asked if they wanted to put their name on a chip that went on Perseverance, and so some of them have their name on that chip. That's cool. So they're on Mars.
Wow. Cool.
India, that was you, right?
Yeah, it was a really cool program, and they're still doing it for the new one that they're currently working on for 2026. So
what? I want my name on Mars.
I'll send you the link.
Yeah.
Please do.
We'll send you the link. Who else anyone else have questions? Okay, yeah, maybe we should go back to that list then.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the last question here, what advice would you give to somebody pursuing a career in this field, I guess marine biology or science in general? And I can give you a couple of advice. The first one is to just stay curious and ask as many questions as you can think of. There's no stupid question, and there's nothing wrong with asking questions and thinking about things. The other thing is, don't get stuck on one path and thinking that this is the one thing that you need to do in life forever. Everything you do will kind of help you in your career as a scientist. And maybe you don't want to be a scientist, but any sports activities, or if you play video games, or if you do whatever you're passionate about, will help you become a better scientist, because there's many different skills that you need as a scientist, and those are skills you can't gain from just going to university and studying science or biology. You gain those by being in clubs like this one, and by volunteering and being passionate about certain things and doing those things that you really love. And at the end, you will notice that you've gained those skills from doing different things that will help you become a scientist. So just keep doing the things you love and keep an open mind and stay curious. I think that's the main thing.
That's great advice. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask or chime in with? Comments? I think we're at the end then.
Great.
And look at that. It's that just about an hour. Oh, there's one. Can you find phytoplankton on top of a mountain?
Yeah, if there's water on there. There's a lot of phytoplankton that live in high altitudes where there's like, in high altitude lakes. And they're especially adapted to live where there's a lot of UV light. So they have special pigments to help protect them against UV light. But yeah, if there's water on top of a mountain, you will find phytoplankton there, I guarantee you.
And there was another one. Are phytoplankton harmful to ingest?
So the vast majority of phytoplankton are going to be harmless. So you're not going to even notice that they're in the water. So like every time you go swimming and you get some water in your mouth, you're getting millions of phytoplankton cells in there, and you're going to be fine. There's only a few species that are toxic, and those cause like shellfish poisoning and stuff like that. So you want to be careful with those. But governments have really strong monitoring programs for these types of phytoplankton, especially in the U.S. and Canada, where people collect water samples often, and they can look at satellite data and see where these phytoplankton are, and they can advise fisheries when these things are happening. Yeah, so a lot of the times you see like, oh, there's shellfish recalls, or the shellfish fishery is closed for a few weeks or a few months, and that's because of phytoplankton, toxic phytoplankton in the water.
We're in an area of New York where there are quite a few natural lakes that are open for swimming. Very often in the summer are state parks, and very often they've been closing the beaches a lot, they say, due to toxic levels of, and I'm not sure if it's phytoplankton or what it is, but they were saying, it was toxic, and if you got it on your skin, you would get a rash and so forth. Is that a phytoplankton?
Yeah, it could be. So those are actually becoming more common because of warming. So as the temperatures warm, those types of phytoplankton are becoming more and more common. And that's something we're seeing in Canada now too. So it is a type of phytoplankton, yeah. We also had to close a bunch of lakes here because of that.
Yeah. Is there anything else, folks? Well, folks, I think we should thank Loay for joining us, right? This was pretty awesome. I thought it was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great chatting with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. That's great.
Yeah, no, this was a good group. And I will send you that link to the next rover project. So I have your email. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions after this, please forward them to Michelle, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions later on. And I'd be happy to come back and do a presentation on something more specific if you like, or anything like that. So just let Michelle know, and she'll let me know.
I'm sorry, my dog is just having he's not happy right this minute. I think he wants his dinner.
Dinner time.
But folks, if you do have more questions, just feel free to shoot them over to me, and I will send them over to Loay, okay? I do want to let you know that, all right, I think maybe he wants to come on camera. That could be what it is too. There he is. All right, so I want to let you know our next meeting is next Thursday. We have another guest speaker lined up for next Thursday, March 4th at 6 o'clock. My mother's cousin is going to talk to us. Her name is Donna Grossman. She's a retired aeronautical engineer who designed systems for the space shuttles when they were in service. So she's going to talk to us about the space program and about space shuttles and designing systems for space, what it's like to go to a launch, all that kind of stuff. So if you have questions, start thinking now. She'll be joining us 6 o'clock next Thursday, and I'll put an announcement up in our Google Classroom for that next week, okay? So tell your friends. Well, Loay, it was great having you.
Awesome. It was a lot of fun, guys. Good luck with the rest of the school year and everything else.
It's been an adventure. Let's put it that way, right, kids?
We're almost out of it, though.
Yeah, we're learning a lot about perseverance, and thank goodness we have technology. Otherwise, I don't know what we would do. So But again, thank you so much, Loay.
Of course. Have a good
Okay,
night,
take
everyone.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
All right, folks, thank you so much.
Do you need the officers to stay on at all?
No, I
Bye.
think we're good.